Let's start with something that confuses people the most, because it feels so subtle, so personal, and yet so devastating over time. One of the core reasons you walk away from a narcissistic relationship feeling like the villain is projection. This isn't just blame shifting, this is a psychological offloading process. When someone cannot tolerate guilt, shame, or self-reflection, they don't sit with it, they export it, and you become the destination. Every human being makes mistakes. Most of us can say, I messed up, feel uncomfortable for a moment, and then learn. A narcissistic personality doesn't have that luxury. Shame feels annihilating. Accountability feels like erasure. So instead of absorbing those feelings, they redirect them outward. If they lied, you're untrustworthy. If they were cruel, you're abusive. If they withdrew, you're demanding. Their internal discomfort doesn't disappear. It simply changes address. What makes this so powerful is that you are usually a conscientious person. You care. You self-reflect. You want to do better. So when the finger points at you, you don't swat it away. You look inward. You start reviewing conversations. You replay arguments. You ask yourself, did I say that wrong? Was my tone off? Am I being unfair? Meanwhile, the person who actually caused the harm feels relief. Their emotional burden has been successfully transferred. Over time, this creates an emotional imbalance. They feel lighter. You feel heavier. They walk away from conflict calm, sometimes even smug. You walk away dysregulated, anxious, and ashamed, even when you can't quite explain why. That's projection working exactly as intended. You're carrying emotions that don't belong to you, and because they're sitting inside your body, they feel like truth. And here's where it gets especially damaging. After enough repetition, the projection becomes internalized. It's no longer just something they say in arguments. It becomes the voice in your own head. You begin to preemptively apologize. You assume fault before evidence. You hesitate to bring up concerns because you already know how the story will end, with you feeling like the bad person for even speaking. This is how someone else's unresolved shame quietly becomes your identity. You might notice that they rarely ask real questions about themselves. They don't sit with discomfort. They don't show curiosity about their impact. Instead, they remain oddly certain. And certainty, especially loud certainty, is convincing. When someone repeats something often enough and with enough confidence, even a grounded person can start to wonder, what if they're right? That's not because you're weak, it's because you're human. So if you've walked out of a relationship wondering how you became the villain in a story where you were trying to love, communicate, and survive, understand this: you weren't exposed. You were assigned a role. Their guilt never disappeared. It just learned how to speak using your voice. After projection has done its work, something else quietly takes over: control of the story itself. Because once someone has handed you their guilt, they still need to make sure the meaning of everything that happens protects them. This is where reality starts to feel slippery. You're not just dealing with disagreements anymore. You're dealing with an edited version of events, one where the facts keep changing but the conclusion never does. You're at fault. You may notice how conversations get retroactively rewritten. What was once a calm discussion is later described as an attack. A boundary you set becomes evidence of cruelty. A reaction to repeated mistreatment is reframed as your true character. Details vanish, timelines shift, tone is exaggerated, and intent is assigned without your consent. And when you try to correct the record, you're told you're being defensive, dramatic, or manipulative. The correction itself becomes proof of guilt. This isn't random. When someone can't tolerate accountability, they don't just avoid facts, they replace them. The goal isn't truth, the goal is self-protection. And the most efficient way to protect themselves is to position you as the aggressor and themselves as the injured party. Once that frame is set, everything you do gets interpreted through it. Neutral actions become suspicious. Emotional responses become unstable. Silence becomes punishment. Speaking up becomes abuse. What makes this so destabilizing is repetition. You're not being told the same story once. You're being immersed in it. Over time, the constant retelling starts to override your own memory. You begin to second-guess what you saw, what you felt, what you meant. You might think, I remember it differently, But maybe I'm wrong. That's not a failure of intelligence. That's what happens when your reality is challenged by someone who speaks with confidence and emotional conviction. And here's the painful irony: the more sincerely you try to explain yourself, the worse it gets. Because explanation requires vulnerability, and vulnerability gets weaponized. Every clarification becomes proof that you're calculating. Every attempt to add context becomes over-explaining. You're not allowed complexity, only culpability. Meanwhile, they get to be simple: hurt, misunderstood, blameless. This narrative control doesn't just affect your relationship with them, it spills outward. You start worrying about how others see you. You wonder what version of you is being presented when you're not in the room. You feel a quiet pressure to manage perceptions, to prove you're not the person they've described. And the more you try to defend your integrity, the more exhausted and isolated you become. Eventually, you may stop trusting your own story altogether. You defer to theirs, you shrink your truth, you doubt your memory. That's the cost of living in someone else's reality long enough. It replaces your own, and if you're sitting there, thinking, "How did I lose my footing so completely?" Understand this: when someone controls the narrative, they don't just rewrite events, they rewrite you. Once the story has been rewritten, something even more corrosive happens. Morality itself gets flipped. This is the part that leaves people feeling not just confused but ashamed of who they are, because now it's no longer about what happened, it's about what kind of person you are, and suddenly the very qualities that once defined your integrity are being used as evidence against you. You start to notice that basic healthy behaviors are recast as moral failures. Setting a boundary becomes cold or controlling. Asking for consistency becomes needy. Expressing hurt becomes playing the victim. Even silence, even taking space to regulate yourself, gets reframed as punishment. Meanwhile, their outbursts are called honesty, their withdrawal is self-care, their cruelty is provoked, and their lack of empathy is somehow your responsibility to manage. This inversion works because it targets people who care about being good. You value fairness. You don't want to hurt people. You're willing to look at yourself and grow. So when you're told that your behavior is unethical, unkind, or abusive, it lands hard. You don't immediately dismiss it. You examine it. And that willingness to self-reflect becomes the very lever used to destabilize you. Over time, you may find yourself asking questions you never asked before. Am I selfish for needing this? Am I wrong for being upset? Am I too much? And notice what's happening there. You're no longer evaluating behavior, you're evaluating your worth. That's the shift. The discussion moves away from actions and into character assassination, where you're always on trial and the verdict is predetermined. What's especially painful is how one-sided this becomes. You're held to an impossible moral standard, endlessly patient, endlessly forgiving, endlessly understanding, while they are allowed to be reactive, dismissive, or hurtful, because they were triggered or under stress. Your humanity is treated as a flaw. Theirs is treated as an excuse. And slowly, something breaks down inside you. Your internal compass, the thing that once told you this doesn't feel right, starts spinning. You hesitate before asserting needs. You pre-edit your emotions. You abandon your instincts because you've been taught they're dangerous. When morality gets inverted like this, right and wrong lose meaning, and all that remains is fear of being seen as bad. This is how people end up trapped, not by love, but by self-doubt. You stay quiet not because you agree, but because you're terrified of being labeled cruel. You tolerate mistreatment not because you don't see it, but because you have been convinced that objecting makes you the problem. That's not compromise. That's moral erosion. So if you've walked away feeling like you lost your values, understand this: you didn't fail your ethics. They simply taught you to confuse self-betrayal with being good. After your morality has been flipped and your reality has been questioned, there's another maneuver that keeps you locked in place: the performance of victimhood. And I want to be very clear here. This is not genuine vulnerability. This is not accountability. This is a strategic display of injury designed to shut down your voice and redirect all emotional energy back to them. You'll notice how every attempt to address harm somehow becomes about how much you've hurt them. You bring up a pattern, they bring up their pain. You express exhaustion, they describe suffering. You ask for change, they collapse into wounded innocence. Suddenly, You're not having a conversation anymore, you're managing a crisis. And the original issue quietly disappears. What's happening is emotional hijacking. Their distress takes center stage, and your experience gets erased. You may even feel cruel for bringing things up at all. You think maybe this isn't the right time, or they're already struggling, or I don't want to make things worse. And just like that, your needs get postponed indefinitely, while theirs become urgent and unquestionable. This works especially well on empathetic people. You don't want to hurt someone who's hurting. You don't want to pile on. You don't want to be the reason someone feels bad. So you soften your language, minimize your feelings, and sometimes abandon the conversation altogether. Ether. You become the caretaker of their emotional state, even when you're the one who was harmed. Over time, a dangerous equation forms. Your pain equals cruelty, their pain equals truth. If you cry, you're dramatic. If they cry, it's evidence. If you react, you're unstable. If they react, it's justified. This imbalance trains you to silence yourself, not because you lack insight, but because you've learned that your feelings will always be punished. And here's the quiet tragedy of it. You may start believing that causing them discomfort is inherently wrong, even when that discomfort comes from being confronted with their own behavior. You confuse accountability with harm. You mistake honesty for abuse. And so you stop asking for repair because you've been conditioned to believe that their fragility matters more than your safety. This is how people disappear inside relationships, not through force, but through guilt. Not through control, but through emotional obligation. You're no longer allowed to be both hurt and human. Only they are. So if you found yourself shrinking, apologizing for your feelings, or carrying someone else's pain while your own goes unseen, remember this. Victimhood used as a weapon doesn't heal wounds. It silences truth. After your voice has been silenced and your pain has been eclipsed, the manipulation moves even deeper. This is where it stops being about what happened and starts becoming about who you are. And this is one of the most damaging parts of the entire dynamic. Because now you're not just being told you did something wrong. You're being told you are wrong. You'll hear labels slip into the conversation. You're too sensitive. You're unstable. You're selfish. You're toxic. Sometimes the accusation gets even more twisted. You're told you're the narcissist. And when that happens, it can knock the wind out of you. Because you're the one questioning yourself. You're the one trying to repair. You're the one losing sleep over your impact. Yet somehow, you're being cast as the villain at the core of the story. This is identity-level gaslighting. It's not just disputing facts, it's eroding your sense of self. When someone repeatedly tells you that your reactions are evidence of pathology rather than responses to harm, you start monitoring yourself constantly. You scan your emotions before expressing them. You second-guess your instincts. You wonder if your discomfort means something is fundamentally broken in you. And notice how isolating this is. When you start believing you're the problem, you stop reaching out. You don't want to trash talk. You don't want to be unfair. You don't trust your own perspective enough to share it, so the manipulation happens in private, unchallenged, where their voice becomes the loudest one in your head. What makes this especially painful is that your real personality traits are being used against you. Your empathy becomes evidence that you're overreacting. Your insight becomes proof that you're ruminating. Your emotional awareness becomes a reason to dismiss you. You're punished not for being harmful, but for being human in the presence of someone who cannot tolerate reflection. Over time, you may start building your identity around avoidance, avoiding conflict, avoiding emotions, avoiding being that person. You shrink yourself down to stay safe. And in doing so, you lose access to your own clarity, your confidence, your sense of rightness. You don't feel like yourself anymore, because you've been taught not to trust yourself. And here's the thing I want you to hear clearly. If you were truly the person they describe, manipulative, cruel, narcissistic, you wouldn't be sitting with this level of doubt. You wouldn't be this invested in self-examination. The very fact that you're questioning yourself is not evidence against you. It's evidence of your integrity. So if you walked away from a relationship unsure of who you even are anymore, understand this, they didn't reveal your flaws. They blurred your reflection so you'd stop recognizing your own truth. After all of this, the projection, the rewritten reality, the moral flipping, the silencing, the identity erosion, there's a final outcome that keeps people stuck far longer than they ever expected. And that's conditioned self-blame. This is where the nervous system takes over, not because you're confused anymore, but because you've been trained. At this stage, you may intellectually understand that something is wrong. You might even say, "This doesn't feel healthy." And yet, you keep trying, you keep explaining, you keep adjusting, you keep hoping that if you say it differently, softer, clearer, kinder, it will finally land. Not because you're foolish, but because your body has learned that harmony equals safety and conflict equals danger. This is how trauma bonding forms. It's not about love, it's about relief. Moments of calm feel earned. Moments of kindness feel like proof that things are improving. And moments of tension feel like personal allure. You start believing that if the relationship is struggling, it must mean you're not doing enough, not understanding enough, not giving enough, not forgiving enough. You might notice how quickly you apologize now. Sometimes before the conversation has even fully started, you take responsibility for tone, timing, emotions, even when the content is valid. You over-explain yourself in hopes of preventing misinterpretation. You edit your truth to make it more acceptable. And all the while you're shrinking, not because you want to, but because you've learned that being small feels safer than being seen as bad. What's heartbreaking is how invisible this process is from the outside. People don't see the internal negotiations you're constantly having with yourself. They don't see the exhaustion of carrying all the responsibility for emotional balance. They don't see how much self-betrayal it takes to keep the peace. But your nervous system feels it, that chronic tension, that hypervigilance, that feeling of walking on eggshells, even in silence. And eventually, self-blame becomes automatic. You don't ask, "Was that fair?" anymore. You ask, "How did I mess that up?" You don't wonder, "Why did that hurt?" You wonder, "Why am I so sensitive?" The focus is no longer on repair or reciprocity. It's on survival. And survival has taught you that you are the variable that must change. I want to be very clear about this. Staying doesn't mean you were weak. Trying doesn't mean you lacked insight. Trauma bonds form because intermittent reinforcement, emotional unpredictability, and fear create powerful attachment loops in the brain. You were responding exactly as a human nervous system responds under threat, by adapting. So if you're sitting here wondering why it took so long to leave or why part of you still feels guilty for choosing yourself, remember this. You didn't stay because you were broken. You stayed because you were conditioned to believe fixing yourself was the way to be safe.